You are listening to Missed Apex Tech Time. We live F1. Welcome to Missed Apex Tech Time. I'm your host, Matt Trumpets, and this week we're going to be tapping into the expert F1 tech brain of Matthew Summerfield from Planet F1 to answer some of your questions about the 2026 regs, and mine. Also joining us will be a non-tech voice of chaos and confusion, Alex Van Gene, to stop us whenever he loses track or needs an explanation. We are an independent podcast brought to you with the kind support of our patrons and partners. We might be wrong, but we're first. Today, we will take that 10,000-foot view of the upcoming regs, dive into a few tech reckons, and save the fine-tooth comb for another day. In order to do that, let me say hello and Happy New Year to Matthew Summerfield, a.k.a. Summers. Welcome back, Summers. Good to see you again.
Great to see you as always, Matt, and happy that we are over the precipice of the last regulations and into another set. So lots to dive into.
Yeah, I was thinking you probably are enjoying the fact most of the action is going to be on top of the cars this time round.
Yeah, most definitely. There's going to be a lot more for us to dive into throughout the course of these regulations. The last set I'm very happy to see the back of, let's put it that way.
You would not be the only one. Another person who's very delighted to see the back of these regulations would be Geensy Van Gene. Welcome aboard, Geensy, and Happy New Year. I haven't had a chance to tell you that in person.
Happy New Year to you. And yeah, it was a interesting set of regulations that bounced and broke drivers, and I am very happy to see the back of it. It's a shame the ground force effect didn't work the way we all wanted it to, but we have to move into something new. And I've watched a lot of things on these new regs, and it is quite confusing. And that's part of the reason I wanted to be on this show, because I listen to you guys and it's great and the technical information is great, but I'm like, I have questions. And then you go off to the next subject because you two both understand. And me and probably some of the wider audience might not have quite got down some of the wording and actual understandings of things that go through. So I'm here to assist with that.
Well, I appreciate that. And your patience, because I'm sure it will be required, is greatly appreciated. So let's dive right in. And as is usual, I want to start right at the top with Summers. What is your hottest reg take? Now, I have read these, sort of, but I am not someone who actually sits down and does the drawings. And Spanners has said my job as pretensioneer to the show is now over. What is your actual take as someone who I know is working on a set of articles about these regs? What do you think of them now that you've seen them in their totality and really grappled with them a bit?
Well, I think the big factor to consider is that obviously they're split into two sections. It's the biggest regulation change we've probably had since 2014, and then prior to that, a long way back, probably 2009, and so on, because we're actually getting chassis and power unit changes at once, which is very dramatic when it comes to how that can affect the stable section of the team's orders. We've also got new manufacturers coming on board, obviously for power units. So there's a lot of change, and I think that will be quite dramatic in terms of how that plays out in the beginning of the season, and certainly over the course of this regulation set, especially if we end up in some scenario where we have some knee-jerk reactions to what's going on, just as we did at the start of 2014, which obviously then led to the massive change that we had in 2017 as well.
Right. So you missed our quiz, but I'm going to quiz you right now on your Formula One knowledge. When exactly is the last time we've changed both the power unit and the aerodynamic regulations at the same time? You're probably going to say 2014, but I don't remember it being that dramatic a change in 2014.
Yeah, it was 2014 because we went to the V6 turbo hybrids rather than the V8. So that's the last time that we had a big change, such as this one is right now.
So there's a real possibility for apple carts to be thoroughly upset, which brings me to my next question, which is, what is your boldest prediction that we will totally remember and hold you to account for?
Honestly, I think we'll probably end up with a similar situation to what we've had in the past when we've had these sort of big upsets where one team sort of dominates the early phase of the regulations just purely because they've found something that other teams haven't. And I think that's predominantly going to come down to the power unit manufacturers again, much like it did in 2014. There's obviously a huge amount of rumours swirling around regarding certain design aspects to the power units already. And I do think that those could be misnomers in some way. However, I do think that that's where the big chunk of performance is going to lie in the initial stage of the regulations. And then obviously the teams on top of that need to do a good job from an aero perspective because we've got some massive changes there with things like active aerodynamics and the way in which that the weight turbulence is generated on these cars as well.
Okay, so we have had, in fact, a lot of complaining about these regulations already. We've seen criticism from Pat Simmons, from the teams, from various technical and non-technical commenters. So I'm waving my magic wand. Pick one thing about these regulations that you would change to improve what you think is going to happen when the cars finally hit the track in anger.
Well, I think the most obvious one is the way in which that the power units are operated, and the overall design architecture of both the internal combustion engine and how the energy recovery system will work. You know, I was a bigger fan of the MGUH than many people were in the industry. It has changed the landscape of how these power units will work without the MGUH, and so I think how that power is delivered via the drivers will be problematic in the early phases because of the definite shift in how these power units operate compared to the old ones, especially with how much energy deployment and energy recovery that will have to go on. So that for me is probably the one area I would maybe make some alterations and perhaps put more onus on the internal combustion engine rather than the electrical side. But we're here now. We've got what we've got, and that's why some of the aero regulations have changed to accommodate what we've got.
Pretty good. We're 5 minutes in, and already Geensy has a glazed look of confusion on his face. What's up?
Not confusion, question. Where you talk about the whole energy, obviously we've changed the way we're doing the energy inside the cars, and there's basically less deployment of the energy. Does that mean, do you think we're actually going to have cars running around with no battery power for laps until they bring it back, or just be running at a D rate like they currently are? Is it going to be that dramatic, or do you think it will balance itself out immediately, or it's something they'll work on like by the end of the season or by 2027?
Yeah, it's a scale thing, really. I think what we'll see initially will be the teams having to run to some targets to be able to achieve the sort of lap times that they're looking for. I think one thing that people got confused about as well with the previous set of regulations because of how much more of a hybridization we went towards last time was the fact that people assumed that we'd run out of energy with those power units. And yes, we did have what we called D rates, where basically you'd run out of energy at the end of straights, and you'd be in a situation where you've got less power than your rival, let's say. But the chances of that happening became slimmer and slimmer as the teams understood deployment and recovery better. Now, I think we'll have that to some scale with this incoming set of regulations, especially as what we must be mindful of is that the MG UK now will deliver 350 kilowatts of power. Previously, with the last set of power units, it was 120 kilowatts of power. So we're talking triple the amount of power being deployed by the MG UK, which is why we've got that sort of 50-50 split between the internal combustion engine and the electrical deployment that's been put into place. So obviously that means we're going to have to rely more on braking. We're going to have to find different ways of recovering energy, which will be transient in terms of the way that energy is recovered along straights and those sort of things. So it's a very complicated arena, and things that might not be really explained very well at the beginning of this set of regulations could look bad for the sport in some ways. However, I think over time, let's give them at least 6 to 8 races to better understand things. I think you'll start to see that things will start to measure out a little bit better.
But you think the kind of fear mongering that's going on at the moment of all of a sudden they'll lose 400 horsepower and just be running around on half the power of the car, that probably won't happen unless it's Cadillac.
Well, Cadillac have obviously a Ferrari power unit, so I can't see that being so much of a dramatic issue as perhaps it could well be.
You
But
bank
no,
on the fact they know how to use it.
yeah. What I think is that, as with the 2014 power units and those being hybrid, we had this situation where people assumed that the entirety of what could be deployed would be deployed all at once. And so, because of KERS, which obviously predates both of these systems, that was a button-based system where you had X amount of seconds per lap of usage because you literally just deployed it by the second. Whereas these systems are very much different to that in they don't deliver the power in a linear fashion. That in fact, part of the regulation is that the power tapers as the speed builds. So in other words, what I'm saying is you won't have 350 kilowatts all the way to the top end of the straight. It will start to taper off, and then obviously you'll be recovering more energy. And this is what we've heard from some of the teams, etc., is the fact that you might have to burn some fuel, let's say, in order to recover more energy. So I think there's a lot more strategic aspect to the deployment side of things that is perhaps being left unsaid at the moment. And as you say, it's a bit of scaremongering in some ways because, you know, you just look at the headline figures and think, oh, we've got 350 kilowatts and suddenly we're going to be out of power. Well, that's not the case. And obviously then we have the overtake mode as well, which is, supplementary to that, and which is a tool for overtaking that is taking over from DRS from a deployment side of things. So there's plenty of things going on in terms of energy deployment and energy recovery that I think are being treated very much in a 1 and 0 fashion rather than having a little bit more of a nuance to it, which is what this will need.
All right. Well, there goes my carefully constructed show. Thank you, Geensy. Appreciate that. We're talking about power units. One of the reckons that we had about power units in Sunday's show that I wanted to bring to you specifically was that Alistair H reckons that a lot of teams will be changing engine suppliers mid-regulations. Now, I actually happen to think there's a good reason for this, but I'm curious to get your take on it before we dive into some more specifics about the power unit regulations.
Okay, so I think what we have to think about here now, though, is how many teams are going to be considered what we would call works outfits. So if you're thinking about swapping power unit manufacturers, well, are you a works outfit or are you a team that is getting your power unit supply from somebody else? So let's take McLaren for argument's sake, because they aren't a works outfit. They will take their power unit from Mercedes. So in other words, they could become a free agent. Let's say the Mercedes power unit is the worst of the bunch, and suddenly it's the Honda that you want on board. You know, can you get yourself a deal with Honda without annoying Aston Martin? And this is the political landscape of the situation. And I do think there may be some small movements here and there from certain teams, but I do think that there's also a case of there's too many teams that are locked into deals, and it's going to be difficult for them to make those moves around. The only sort of free players in some respects are the likes of Alpine, who obviously have signed with Mercedes as a deal, but could, in theory, make a move somewhere else. But then you've got the likes of, say, Racing Bulls. You know, they're locked in with their own power unit as such. So can they make a deal elsewhere? We've seen Red Bull drop power unit deals in the past in order to get performance. So I don't think it's something that we'll see a great deal of, but I do think there is potential for it to happen, but it won't happen very early on, I don't think.
My reason is much simpler, and it's just based on the math of it. I believe Mercedes has 4 customers right now. Ferrari has 3. And so I could easily see 1, if not 2 Mercedes teams, especially if they're not dependent on Mercedes for large amounts of other parts. So if we look at Ferrari, Haas is not going anywhere. They're too dependent on the Ferrari ecosystem of supplied parts. to get away with it. But a team like Alpine, that mostly already designed the entire rest of their car, team like Williams might decide that they would get better service. Like a Williams Honda, I could totally see happening if Aston didn't think they would be threatening, for example. So I think just from a mathy point of view, Mercedes has too many customers, and they've already said it's a bit of a problem for them at the beginning of the regulation set. And that kind of implies that mm, they have to have all the engines supplied to everybody before even their team gets an upgrade by the regulations, if I've understood them correctly.
Yeah, and on top of that, we also have to think about the caveat of fuel as well, and lubricants, and the way in which that they are going to be distributed dependent on the power unit manufacturers. So that could be a factor in some ways, as it has been in the past in Formula One, and that can drive change up and down the grid. Albeit, I think a lot of the teams that you've just mentioned, i.e. Alpine and Williams, have long-term contracts in place with Mercedes. And so, as we know, contracts don't mean very much in Formula One, but it's still a hurdle that would have to be overcome in order to make moves.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these regulations. And I immediately want to get Geensy in here because I'm sure he's not heard of a duo. But to me, of all the things in the regulations that are like interesting and promising, I think a duo, as far as a power unit is concerned, is one of them. So why don't you run that down for us and explain it a little bit?
A duo what?
Yeah, I meant Summers. Explain
I,
it to
I
you,
did think
Geensy. I
that. He
was waiting.
paused and looked at me. How are we
Well,
spelling a duo?
ADUO.
Right, okay.
The
Sorry,
FIA is
Summers.
in love with
Explain away.
acronyms. They are
well,
in love with
why
acronyms.
don't
I
you
apologize.
explain the acronym first, Matt? Because I think that's the
It's additional development and update options for your power unit manufacturers. And then I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, yeah. So basically, in the previous set of regulations for 2014, when the hybrids first came in, we had what was called a token system, and I'm sure many people loved the talk about the token system back in the day. And it was basically a way in which that manufacturers could spend their way out of trouble when it came to the development aspect of their power unit, because they'd got themselves backed into a corner in terms of how they'd actually design things. So a duo is going to be similar in some respects, I guess. In other words, we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, this power unit is this X or Y ahead of their opposition. And so we're going to allow a period of time for development to the teams that, the manufacturers that need to catch up, in order that we get something closer to parity. And I believe that those lines obviously will be drawn over a period of time. So we sort of have months in between the duo periods, let's call them. And that's kind of how things will work. It's very similar to the token system in some respects, in order that one team can't have an advantage that's baked in forever. It's a way in which that the power unit manufacturers can catch up in some respects.
The thing that I liked about it is there are multiple periods per season, and they apply in the season. The measurements happen in the season. You don't have to wait till next season to start catching up. And as I recall, with my increasingly dodgy memory here, as I recall, you're not limited to what you update. Instead, it will be a measurement thing where if you gain too much over your rivals, then you yourself will now be no longer eligible for it.
Yeah, so it's a bit of cat and mouse effectively, because what you would find in the background, you're going to hold on to in some respects, perhaps, because you don't want to give yourself an ever increasing advantage whereby the others can't catch up, or you overtake them because they've stood still. So it's an interesting way to deal with the problem of parity. I still think the token system was a good way of doing things, albeit very convoluted in its approach. And perhaps this is just a better way of doing things without confusing people entirely.
I also like it because it sort of plays into the wind tunnel and testing time regulations that we already have. It sort of aligns everything in the same general approach. So I like it that way. Marcello reckons that the compression ratio loophole isn't much of a loophole. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier in the show, I think a lot of what we're hearing about now is stuff that is being overbaked just purely because we're starved of information and action coming from the F1 circuit itself. So a lot of things that we'll see in the media at this stage in the season are just purely things that are there to entice people to read or listen to content as such. Yes, there's clearly an advantage in some respects if this is a possibility. There's no clarification as to whether it's been proven that one team does, or one manufacturer, sorry, does have this advantage over the rest of the field. In as much as the way that we've heard about certain other design aspects of the power units as well. I just think it's a case of let's wait till we see the flag drop, and that's always the best way with these kind of situations.
How long have you been coming on this show? This is not how we do things at Mr. Apex, and you know it.
I do.
Um, yeah, you
He's
do,
saying
but and
it's a
yet you
racing
still come
incident, Matt,
on.
isn't he? He's saying it's
Yeah,
a racing incident.
yes, that's
So
basically what he
we
is.
can't have that. It's because my understanding is the two manufacturers that are going to have it is Mercedes and Red Bull, and we'll know if it's a big difference if the other teams complain come race one. I think that's the way we will see it. But listen, compression ratio is more compression ratio, more bang, more power. So if it's real, it is an advantage. It just depends whether it's actually real or not.
And it's how much of an advantage. That's the question. It is, how big of an advantage are we talking here?
I've
Apples
heard
and
as much as
oranges.
15 horsepower.
Yeah, but apples and oranges, you design one thing in one way to gain 15 horsepower, but you lose something else somewhere else. It's not just a case of, oh, this works and we're going to blow everybody away because we've got 15 horsepower here. Somebody else might have found something else that gets them 20 horsepower. Things like the fuel are such a massive factor with this new set of regulations that if you get that right or wrong, you're going to have a big advantage or disadvantage compared to your rival. So I don't think this is the be all and end all. It's just simply, this stage of a regulation set where we're looking for stories to try to drive the narrative forward.
And I guess it's contentious because rather than I can't remember the actual ratio is, but because they're talking
18
about
is 16-1 now. It was 18 in the
yes.
previous.
So the contention is the fact that the reports are the number is higher than it should be. Therefore, is it legal? Is it right? That's what's causing the contentious issue when somebody else might have a double diffuser type thing hiding somewhere on their car that will give them even more.
Yeah, and I think the other thing there is that, as you say, it's the hidden aspect of it because albeit that the ratio could be, let's just say they have found a way of manipulating the ratio above the limit, which will be a thermal thing because of the way that the regulations are written. If they have managed to find that and they have found that 15 horsepower, the question will be, how long is it before the FIA find a better way of measuring this? Because it's a bit like the front wing flexion tests where it's a static thing. The compression ratio is measured statically, whereas obviously the intent of what's being talked about is that this has been done past the point of static. And so how do you measure things beyond the test that you currently have in place? And that's where the FIA will have to put a line in the sand and say, we need to make changes to how we do these things in order to appease the other manufacturers, or we have to open things up to allow them to be able to make these changes as well, which, as Matt mentioned with a duo, that could be something that could be looked at in the future. Or there could be a place, well, this power unit is legal now, but we'll put a line in the sand and say you've got to make changes by X date in order that you come in line with everybody else.
So one thing I want to sort of follow up on here is that everyone's saying it's an advantage, but it's only an advantage in that everything else is equal. And what no one has talked about, I mean, Geensy, I was impressed. You knew the effect of increased compression in a power unit. That's good. But there are downsides, and one of the biggest downsides is with increased bang comes increased heat. With increased heat comes increased cooling. With increased cooling means bigger packaging, less slippery when you're in your straight line mode. So it's not 100% baked in, which I think was the point that you were making there. Uh, but for example, are we allowed still pre-chamber ignition in this regulation set, as we saw with Ferrari in 2014-15 introduce, and Honda sort of follow up?
Well, it was Mercedes who did TGI first, I believe, and everybody else sort of followed along the path. But yes, but there's also other things that have been taken away. So 2014 moving into 2015 was an interesting period with the power units, because we went from having static inlet trumpet length to variable inlet trumpet length, and now we're removing that again. So, you know, there
Trumpet
are
length. I don't assume that's something to do with Matt. So what is trumpet length?
So the trumpets obviously have the air coming into the power unit, and there was a point in which they could be changed in terms of their length. It helps with multiple facets of how the power unit will operate. However, these power units don't have that. It's just a part of the design parameters of it. And that's what I'm saying. A lot has changed. Yes, at the core, we've still got a 1.6 litre V6 internal combustion engine, but the parameters in which that we're operating that power unit internal combustion engine is very different, because of the amount of electrical side of the power unit that needs to be incorporated into it. So it's not apples and oranges. It's not like saying, oh, look, we've got two V8s that are exactly the same as one another, as we had in the past, let's say. These are two very different internal combustion engines. And so there's obviously different parameters that have had to be set up in order to accommodate that as well. And obviously things that worked in the past with the previous hybrid power unit will not work with these power units, purely because the makeup of them is very different in how they would operate.
Right. Am I remembering correctly? The electric energy now can't run ancillaries, whereas before, like at the MGUH, it could run like a lot of non-drive electric stuff. Like
Uh,
they
the,
have walled, or is vice versa. There's some change in the energy flow that I'm halfway remembering.
they've always walled off the chassis side of things from how much can be deployed on that side. So I think it's only 300 kilojoules or something stupid like that.
But the H used to be able to run a lot of that stuff, and they've
Well,
not allowed for the K to do that, right?
Yeah, so that the H did a huge amount of the heavy lifting in terms of the power unit side of things, because it was an unlimited exchange of energy between it and the MGUK anyway. You didn't really need the energy store, which is the problem of these regulations, because you don't have that meter in the middle in order to deal with the void of energy that Alex was talking about earlier, that people might be scared about in terms of running out of energy on a straight. The MGUH used to fill in for that in many respects. And obviously that isn't the case anymore, because it just doesn't exist within the architecture of the power unit. So we're obviously going to be reliant on the MGUK to do much more of that heavy lifting, in order that it's got the power to deploy throughout the course of a lap, as well as to the recovery side of things.
All right, so I'm going to go with one more reckon here, and this is just because it's made it out into the popular press. And that's Tim Rudd going, he reckons Ferrari will revert to an aluminum cylinder header within 6 months. So do you know what's going on with that story? Of course you do. And could you just could you explain it in a way that makes Geensy ask some fun questions? That's really all I want.
Like, again, I kind of just didn't mention it earlier. I was trying to hint at the fact that there's things been said in the media, and this is one of them. Again, it's something that we've heard many times in the past, that Ferrari have come up with this, or Mercedes have done X, or so on or so forth. And again, it's just a simple design choice. They've opted for a steel cylinder head rather than, the traditional option, in order that they can run their power unit in a specific way compared to how somebody else might. But there's a trade-off, and that's the problem with Formula One. There's always, in design, there's always going to be a trade-off. If you make gains in one side, you're going to make a loss at somewhere else. It's not a free gain. You're just deciding to make a different design choice than somebody else. And in fact, yes, Ferrari may have opted for a steel cylinder head, but doesn't that mean that somebody else might have done that and we just don't know about it? These are the things that, again, I think get a little bit overbaked, because we're trying to drive forward some narratives because we're a little short on information ahead of a season.
So what do we think the reason would be that they would have gone not for aluminium rather than steel? Because obviously aluminium probably lighter, steel probably deals with the heat better, and I assume that's the route they've gone down. Maybe their engine runs hot because they've got rid of the MGUH, so they have to manage the heat more. Maybe steel's the better option. Is that kind of where we're going with this, which is they're looking at different solutions for different problems?
Yeah, exactly. So you're obviously in the right ballpark, and that also then bears in mind what they do in terms of their cooling options. As Matt's already talked about, this formula that we're heading towards with this set of regulations is not only driven by performance from the power unit, it's delivered by the amount of drag you can reduce, because you need to, in order that the power unit can do what it needs to do as well. So these cars need to be super efficient. And this could be a factor in terms of reducing the size of the side pods, for argument's sake.
Going back to the
Reducing,
bottle shape stuff McLaren was
yeah,
so desperate to have.
reducing the size of the car itself, in order that you reduce the aerodynamic drag on the car. And so these are choices that are being made by the manufacturers to help the chassis side effectively, and it's a knock-on effect or a tumbling effect. Whether it's the right option, we will find out shortly. Whether they have to go backwards, we will find out shortly. But I don't think it's something that is necessarily baked into the design, in as much as that they can't have a redo because of what we've already talked about with the power units being able to be made changes to. But again, like I say, there's always a trade-off, pros and cons to everything you do. So if you make a gain here, where are you going to lose out? And that will be the question that will be asked of Ferrari if what they've decided doesn't actually pan out to work for them.
I have zero faith in Ferraris doing anything right at the moment.
Well, history. Okay, never mind. I'm just not going to carry on with that. I want to take it back for a second. Then I do have I have many questions for you. However, I recognize that now may not be the time for all of them. But we're talking really here about design choices within the power unit and how it affects the broader car. So I'm just going to ask you to step back, because unlike me, you have been working on articles about these regulations. And just from a design choices point of view, with Active Aero, with this power unit, where are the compromises? What are you looking at as an overall car? Where are you making your compromises? Where do you think the most lap time is going to be found? Is it, like you said, smaller, slipperier when the Active Aero is deployed? Or is it going to be, nope, it's all about that power unit, just like it was in 2014?
Okay, so I think the low-hanging fruit will actually be, from an aerodynamic perspective, in line with how the power unit itself operates as well. And the reason I mention that is because of Active Aero. So I think you also have to bear in mind that these regulations have been have tried to be written in a way in which we reduce the reliance on outwashing aerodynamic turbulence. So over the course of the last, 20 years, maybe longer, there's been a huge reliance on Formula One designers using outwash to generate aerodynamic performance. And these regulations have been written specifically to try to combat that, in order that you reduce the wake turbulence, and it improves how the car behind reacts to the air that is being pushed over it by the lead car. Now, that has always and always will be, in my opinion, one of Formula One's biggest issues. It's why we went to inverted air commas ground effect with the last section of cars to try to combat this. However, the FIA didn't really step in when the teams made some, let's say, controversial design decisions last time out in order that they could recover some of the outwash that was being generated by the teams and designers. Now, this set of regulations have tried to create what we call inwash. So, in other words, the air that's coming in from the front of the car washes in towards the downforce generating aspects, i.e., your side pods, your floor, your underfloor diffuser, etc., which is counterintuitive to how a Formula One designer will obviously want the car to be designed. And so we've got things like the front wing is narrower than previous. The end plates sit inboard of where they have in the past. We've got a foot plate back. We've got a dive plane back. And they're designed to try to push the air inside the tyre rather than outside of it, which is what the designers would prefer. And then we have a thing called the floorboard. Now, I have a major issue with some of the lexicon that Formula One decide to use because, frankly, the floorboard, are you joking me? Anyway, so the floorboard is also designed to sit in a range behind the rear wheel that is supposed to inwash the airflow towards the side pod and then not push it outwards, which reduces the wake turbulence. Now, these things have contributed towards the overall design of the car, obviously. However, the teams are going to rip this apart and try to get back to a point where they're creating outwash. It's as simple as that. They want to create outwash because it generates downforce for them. And this is where the crux of it for me will lie, in as much as what can the teams recover that the FIA haven't really secured in the regulations, and how strong are the FIA prepared to be in reining the teams in if suddenly they do have this access to outwash that, the regulations aren't intending to have. It's the unwritten consequences that are always going to drive performance forward. And that's, for me at least, where I think we'll find a huge chunk of performance for the teams is from that side of the aero.
All right, I love this. Welcome to your first multi-part question of the year. You say floorboard, and all I can think of is my friend with a 35-year-old Nissan and a piece of plywood as a floorboard in the backseat because there was a giant hole where the floor used to be. But if I understand it correctly, you're essentially describing the area that used to carry the Venturi tunnels in the previous regulation set. So behind the front wheels, but sort of ahead of the plank and the bib.
No, so outboard of that,
Okay,
where
I got it wrong. Good.
Where you would expect the outer floor fence to have been in the previous set of regulations, and where a lot of teams used to have what we would call deflectors in
floor
the past.
fence. I apologize. I called them Venturi tunnels, but the floor fence is what you. Okay, great.
Yes.
Go. No, carry on.
Yeah, so that floorboard itself, it can be a three-piece construction, and there's certain criteria around it in terms of dimensions and what you do in terms of the radius, etc. But it's quite loosely written in many respects for Formula One regulation in terms of what the teams will look at it and say, well, I want to do something different here. I don't want they simply do not want the airflow to go inboard, because then that destroys performance to the underfloor and diffuser. They want to push that out wide of the car in order that they gain performance. And that is the crux of the problem, because the designers will always push the regulations in a way in which favours them. And there's been some changes to the regulations, in fact, since they were first written, that have also favoured the designers, because they've now got more tools at their disposal in order to deal with problems like wake turbulence that they didn't have at the beginning. And that's because of the FIA allowing a little bit more rope for them, because they were scaremongered into believing that the power unit wasn't going to be able to do what perhaps it needed to, and so we'll have to make up with it with aerodynamic efficiency instead. So we've got things like the slots ahead of the rear wheels, which we've had under previous regulations and help with things what we call tyre squirt, which is where the airflow is pushed laterally into the diffuser. So that is an area where teams will obviously have different designs. In as much as I also believe that, as we saw at the start of the last regulations 22, we had a diverging design solutions on the side pods, and that was all because of the weight turbulence coming off the front wheels and how you dealt with that weight turbulence. So I think we'll have that very similar with this rule set. Teams will have looked at it very differently to one another and tried to find performance there. There's a huge scope, in my opinion, from the aero side of things, and I do believe that is where we will see the biggest differences. And obviously, we'll see those differences because they're visual as well.
All right, so let's start with this then. By my understanding, what you were saying is effectively the teams have kind of rolled the FIA a little bit and gained more room for them to come up with more outwashing solutions, which, just so that I'm clear on it, the reason outwash never goes away is because it is the most efficient way to achieve downforce for your car, even though it's worse for the car that follows you. Is that sort of cover it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you're not designing the other person's car. You're not designing the trailing car. All you're concerned with is designing a car that is the quickest in free air, and that is why the designers will chase Outwash, because they don't care about where that turbulence is going. All they care about is improving how their car works, and for them, at least, Outwash is a better way of achieving that result.
Yeah, outwash is not a me problem, in other words.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's talk about this then. Sort of these, I will call them loopholes, but sort of these unaddressed areas in the regulations. You're very focused on them. How much performance are we talking about? Potentially limiting the gains from power units? Like how powerful do you think these might be in relationship to the, say, looking back at 2014, the very obvious fact that the new power unit, Mercedes Advantage, just overpowered everyone. It didn't matter if you were Red Bull and had the best aero in the world. You weren't going to do anything until you got close to parity with your power unit. So is it going to be different with regards to that?
It depends on how big the gaps are from the power unit side of things. But we've got so many power units this time round compared to last time as well. So I think the variance will be lower because of that factor. I do think there's going to be outliers. I think there's going to be manufacturers that have got it wrong, and there's going to be manufacturers that have got it really right. But somewhere in the middle there, you're going to have a clump of manufacturers that are very much together in terms of what they've been able to achieve. And is the difference in aerodynamic efficiency and aerodynamic performance going to outweigh, say, a few horsepower difference between one power engine manufacturer's power unit design compared to the other? It depends on the percentages at the end of the day. Is it a 1% difference between the best and the worst power unit? Is it a 10% difference? Because if it's a 10% difference, then the aero isn't making up that difference. However, I do think that where the big gains in terms of aerodynamic performance might lie further down the line comes from the difference between the stable aerodynamic mode, i.e. what's happening when we've got full downforce, and what is happening when we've got the active aero in place and down the straights, because that will make a big difference in terms of how cars operate at different circuits. We saw that through the previous era. Certain cars were better at certain types of downforce configurations, and perhaps I think we might see that again with these cars all being equal, which I don't think we all will be equal to start with. But as we converge on ideas, because that's essentially what happens in Formula One. You see an idea can I apply that in a way in which the performance on my car will increase because of that idea? And that's why we see teams follow suit with certain designs, albeit obviously over time, those ideas are lessened because the regulation boxes become more and more constrained.
Okay, so we're talking about aerodynamics now, and I sort of love this. We've mainly skipped over this, but just to go over the basics of it, there is either full deployment of your aerodynamics, meaning you're generating at a given speed maximum downforce of your design, and that's going to happen primarily once you enter a braking zone. Once you touch the brakes, just like the old DRS, once you start braking, uh, you'll have that deployment. And then when you get to a point on a straight, you will then be allowed to minimize the amount of downforce by closing the front wing and opening the rear wing. Do I have that right?
Okay, so you think of what we had with flexi wings. If you want to have an idea of what's going to happen with the front wings, they're simply just going to back off, i.e., the flaps are going to drop, and that will reduce the drag and downforce on the front wing. On the rear wing, it's very similar to DRS, albeit you can have up to 3 elements in the rear wing now rather than 2.
And this is a passive system, not a driver-activated system.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, it's very dissimilar to DRS in many ways, but I also think that it's important to remember that we've had both systems in place in different ways before in Formula One. So in 2009 and 2010, we actually had an adjustable front wing flap design that was pretty much useless, to be perfectly honest, because
It was a gimmick.
It wasn't a gimmick. It would have worked if we
felt
hadn't
like
have
a
had double
gimmick.
diffusers. Double diffusers killed that design aspect.
Okay.
It would have allowed the drivers to have a balance shift on the car, essentially. I don't think it was ultimately very powerful back then, but in line with also having the rear wing solution that we're going to have this time around, I think it sort of helps in terms of rebalancing the car for both modes, let's call them, straight line and cornering modes. Although Formula One wants to ditch that lexicon already. So yes, the advantage for me at least will come down to how much downforce can I generate when we're in cornering mode, and how much drag can I strip off the car when I'm in straight line mode, and that's essentially what we're looking for here. But what will look very dissimilar to what we're used to in the opening stages of next season will soon become something that we don't even care about, because it doesn't really mean anything to the viewer. That's the thing. You don't realise what's going on because all you're doing is stripping drag off the car.
And this kind of leans into a conversation we've had in our WhatsApp chat and very briefly in a couple of conversations we've had on the show, but we've never had someone who can actually answer it for us. Does that mean we're going to get an issue when it comes to changing front wings? So if you knock off an end plate, the understanding is the car's technically not legal, so that you then have to go in and change a front wing, but changing front wings could be problematic, slow, or almost impossible to the point where you have no point doing it and you end your race. How is that actually going to work? Because there's loads going around that I haven't heard a single answer that's made me go, oh, okay, it's fine, or it's not, or
It depends on the damage at the end of the day, Alex. I mean, obviously, if you've completely crunched the front wing, then you're going to have to go in and make a change. However, the amount of overhang that we have on the foot plate this time around compared to what I would consider to be the actual front wing is quite substantial. It's quite a way inside the front wheel line. So the chances of actually destroying a front wing to the point whereby you have to come in and make a change because it doesn't work aerodynamically in both modes, I think is quite slim. It just depends on the amount of damage in reality. And obviously the teams will try to work out how robust these designs need to be in order that they don't have that problem as well. Because at the end of the day, you're going for a pit stop because you've broken your front wing and you've got to change it, well, there's your race gone effectively, isn't it? As we know, unless you pick up a safety car or a VSC or something along those lines. So I don't think it'll be a huge narrative in many ways because of the ancillary design of the front wing and the way in which that the actual movable section of the front wing works. Because I think that most teams will put the movable aspect of the design at the most inboard section, i.e. under the nose. And then you've got to destroy the nose for that to become problematic as well.
Are they a hydraulic system or an electric system?
It'll be hydraulic. Yeah, I would have thought. I mean, they may decide to go for an electrical actuator, but I would imagine it'll be a hydraulic one. We have seen 2 designs, in fact, already, because of the prototypes that we saw on the Ferrari and the Mercedes at the postseason test. So we've seen some early versions of what we can expect. But yeah, I would imagine the actuator is going to sit under the nose of most cars. And then obviously that becomes less reliant on damage from the actual, flap section.
And how much information do you think we're going to get publicly from this not first test in Spain in a couple of weeks, whenever it is? Do you think we're going to get any real information from it? Is it going to purely be an engine test because it's in Spain? I know it's raining and horrible in Spain.
Yeah, I don't think that there's going to be a huge amount to be drawn from it, even if we did get some information, just purely because, if you're a power unit manufacturer or a team, you're just going to be sandbagging, aren't you, at the end of the day? You're not going to be wanting to show your hand to the teams, let alone the rest of the world. However, there will also be some what I would call spy stuff going on between the teams in terms of understanding audibly what's going on with their opposition's power units and that sort of thing. So it's going to be an interesting phase, but as we tend to find with this stage of a regulation set, you're not going to get all of the information. I mean, look at what Mercedes did for 22. They had 2 cars at the start of that regulation set. So, I already understand that some of the teams are at that game. They're just literally taking a bare bones prototype to Spain in order that they can understand what's going on with the power unit more than anything else.
An engine with some bodywork on it.
Yeah, and the systems on the car, there's no need for them to actually release their car. It's as much as the same as what we talk about with launch season. How much of it that you see on the launch of a car is actual reality, and a lot of it is not reality. And in as much as that, we also have what we call show cars now, where it's an interpretation of the regulations with a livery just posted on it, in order that they can show it for their sponsors. But we don't get to see the car. And I don't think we'll really get to see the cars until perhaps the start of the second test. That's when we will really start to dive into what's the differences between each of the teams.
So this is just like an extended filming day, in other words, because that's sort of what the teams had been up to. They would put a car on track. They'd call it a filming day. And they're just making sure the brakes work. They're making sure that the computer systems all work. They're making sure the DRS works. And it's not about achieving lap times. It's not about testing reliability. It's about just a very most basic systems check and gathering basic data on how the car systems are interacting with each other when they're being driven on a track and not in a computer.
Yeah, I would really classify what's going on at Barcelona as a group shakedown. We often see teams shaking their cars down prior to the season starting. But I think this is more of a group environment for that to happen in. And obviously over an extended period, because we've got such a big shift from the power unit side of things, also from having active aero and all these systems that have to operate, that the teams now need to understand and make sure are working prior to them actually getting to the races.
So it's also kind of a little bit of a comment on how concerned maybe the FIA has become after these regulations were adopted. Like they've said, oh, we will actually give you, we already had 2 tests instead of 1. And they said, oh, in addition, will give you even more time. Well, they granted the teams the right to do this. This is organized directly by the teams, as I understand it. So it's not an FIA thing, but the FIA said, we'll give you the time to do that if you want to organize it. Whereas in any other season, it would have been absolutely illegal for them to do this.
Should we also call it an FOM thing? Because the reason it
Okay.
can't be designated as a proper test is because who has the rights to testing at the start of the season?
Bahrain have paid for the privilege.
Exactly,
So
and
it's
that's why
not a real test.
This is why it's not classified as a real test, is because of the rights issues associated with testing and what has been given up to Bahrain. So that's why we're going to Barcelona. But like I say, I think a lot of the teams will use it as more of a secret test of their systems more than anything else, and a shakedown of the car.
All right. So before we move on from this, I did have one more question, which is, you mentioned early on, we're sort of looking back to the 2014, even pre-2009 regulations for a lot of what's informing the aerodynamics of this car. Does this mean we're going to go back to seeing mostly push rod designs at the front and pull rod at the rear, which seemed to be the dominant model before that? Or do you think that, because the teams had invested a fair amount in developing pull rod solutions, Red Bull and McLaren and Ferrari even adopted it in the final year, for what reason I still don't entirely understand. So do you think we're just going to revert back to that because they have a lot more data on how that works?
It comes down to what works in the prevailing regulations at the end of the day. The reason that the shift happened is because of aerodynamics more than anything else. The packaging of the actual suspension isn't really an issue, be it pull rod or push rod, front or rear. What we're looking at is how that has an impact on the aerodynamic flow over the rest of the car. And so, because of the way in which the rear suspension will work on these cars and how it interacts with the diffuser, which is much smaller this time around, I suspect we'll go back to pull rod options. I still think there'll be teams that will stick with push rod, but I think in the most part we'll go pull rod there, just from a weight point of view. So you're pulling the weight lower to the base of the car, and at the front of the car, as you mentioned, again, it comes down to packaging and ease of setup, which, again, you know, push rod, pull rod, there's pros and cons, as we talked about previously, about how you use those things and how you package them, um,
What are
to
those
help
pros
you.
and cons?
So it's down to weight and how quickly things can be set up and how those um, components within the suspension interact with other elements within the design of the car. So there's quite an interesting design set of parameters with these cars that I don't think many people will think that's interesting. However, it's to do with the position of the cockpit and also the position of the front axle line, and how those interact with how you have the length of the nose, whether it overhangs the main plane or doesn't overhang the main plane, how you position things aerodynamically around those items. And so there's certain things that, if you design your car one way, you're going to bake into the car, and you won't be able to make certain design choices that other teams have made because they've baked it in another way. We've had this in the past with the 22 cars and so on. And so this could be an interesting facet to the discussion early doors. Who's done what? Why have they done it? And how is it different to everybody else? And I think that could be, one of the lead things going into the start of the season is who's got it right and who hasn't, and why can they not make a change? Well, because it's baked in and we can't make that change. So, interesting things in terms of design from just a few dimensional differences.
Was it Mercedes that had two different mounting points for their front suspension? One of the teams actually gave themselves the option to change it. I think it was Mercedes. Could we see something like that?
Well, we could do. I mean, they only ever changed it in testing. Then they never ran it differently ever again. It was an option. But the thing there is they made that choice and then carried the disadvantage of having that choice, because in order to do what they did meant more weight in the car. It meant more weight on the chassis. And so they were carrying that penalty because they had indecision over what was the best route to take whilst they were designing their car. And so we've seen that in the past as well with other design aspects of the car. And I'm sure we'll probably see it in some respects going forward in this set of regulations where, do I want to do a certain thing in a certain way, or do I want to build in a way of being able to make some changes?
All right. So I want to talk about advantages now. And this to me, when you bring up Mercedes not knowing, that was the case for all of the teams. They all reached a point where their wind tunnel and CFD models essentially meant we're just guessing here because no one could model the airflow correctly underneath the car accurately enough to get an answer. It was just noise and you guessed. And if you got it wrong, then you suffered a host of ill consequences. But one of my favorite reckons is from Dimitri, if I've said that correctly. And he reckoned McLaren's correlation prowess will serve them well despite the wind tunnel time nerf they get for being ahead. And then he goes on to say, also, have you seen the wind tunnel? It's a beast. And suddenly I realized we have a plethora, a spate of new wind tunnels coming online. In the previous regulation set, I'd say that's a huge advantage. But now you're talking about teams that have lots of historic data with aerodynamics of this kind. How much of an advantage is that going to be for the teams? I think it was Aston and McLaren for sure that I know of have new wind tunnels. How much of an advantage will that continue to be for them, do you think?
I don't know. It depends on who's left their cars out in the wind tunnel so they can be copied. As a callback there.
Oh my goodness.
A bit of a callback. But anyway, yeah, it is going to be an advantage. Anybody that has put the resources in place in order to get themselves a new facility is clearly going to have an advantage over somebody who's using something that is years and years old. Obviously, all the time, and without really anybody knowing, there's updates going on to the wind tunnels anyway, to bring them up to speed, let's say. But the likes of McLaren have installed it's not even a new facility. It's a facility that has been shoehorned into a position of the old wind tunnel. So again, a compromise. However, it appears to have been done in a way in which that has been advantageous to performance. So they've got the result they wanted, but it's built within the walls of the MTC in a space that it really shouldn't be able to occupy. So we've got a bit of a strange one there. Obviously, we've got Red Bull with new facilities coming on stream, Aston Martin with new facilities coming on stream, but they've already got somebody who can see the airflow moving anyway. So, as most people would tell you,
Exactly.
yeah, it's an advantage. There's no two ways about it. If you've got new facilities and you know how to operate them correctly, you are going to have an advantage over your competitors. And it's interesting that the timing of which that other teams have spent their resource on making these improvements, knowing obviously that it will pay tenfold coming into a new regulation set at a point when you can make the most gains from the low-hanging fruit. And that's what McLaren did at the end of the last regulation set. You know, they made massive improvements to their car and managed to leapfrog Red Bull, who had been almost seemed like they couldn't be caught. And they made a huge step forward. And so I do see it as a big advantage going forward, yeah.
All right. I'm going to ask one quick question here, which is we did have a reckon, and I'm going to find it now because I've just been scrolling. But they reckoned that the Ford Red Bull engine, this would be Martin GD, will be a potato. Now, they have recruited a very large number of former Mercedes engineers, so much so that they've copied. And this is what concerns me about the Ford power unit. I was just wanting to get your impressions. they've copied what Mercedes were up to, but clearly they had to have started at a later date and perhaps with that not originally in mind as being their main thing. So, do you think Martin has it correct here? It seems like they have an advantage based on what's being reported, but I mean, they've never built an engine for a Formula One car before, and everyone else that's building an engine has. Surely that's some extra reliability risk at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I do have to ask a question.
Yeah, sure.
Do you like jacket potatoes? Do you like them boiled? Do you like them in chips or fries, as you would call them, Matt? There's lots of different
I
types
like
of
them in
potatoes.
chips. But I do like it. It depends on the food they go with. If you're serving them with a nice steak, then I like them a jacket and maybe a little butter, possibly sour cream, chives, that sort of thing.
But you can see where I'm coming from. A potato is not just a potato. So
right.
There's different.
Sometimes it's a meal.
Exactly. There's a varying degree of potato-ness to that question. I mean, if you are thinking logically, you would suggest that a new power unit manufacturer coming into the sport will have more of a difficult time than somebody who is established within the sport and understands how to read the regulations in a very particular way, which is a crux of actually getting performance within this sport, is understanding how to bend the regulations to your advantage. Now, we've got several new manufacturers entering, and that means that there's only so many people or personnel that can be moved around to gain knowledge from another, set of engineers that have worked within the sport before. Or you're getting new people entering the sport and bringing new ideas in, but do those ideas actually jive well with, as I've mentioned, the regulations that are already set in place? So to answer the question without, saying sitting on the fence, I'm not sure that the Ford power unit or Red Bull power unit will be, one of the top tier ones, even though they appear to have found some solutions by taking engineers on from other manufacturers. But having said that, you've got also Audi entering the chat here, who have experience in other formats. And so it's a difficult one, really, to figure out who's going to be best. All you can really do is put your ear to the ground and see who is suggesting what. And the rumour mill would suggest that the ones who are behind are Ford, Audi, and Honda. And the best ones that are going to come out of the pack are going to be the Ferrari and Mercedes power units. But it's like I say, there's varying levels to each rumour that is mentioned. And so, until we actually see the flag drop, we will not know the answer completely.
The only thing that gives me an idea that maybe Red Bull aren't doing too well is something I heard from inside. Was there's a show of confidence where in their bonus scheme that they give to their team members, when someone I know who was there, who was at Red Bull during the days that they were winning, their bonus was based on finishing first or second in the Constructors' Championship. The understanding is now that has been lowered to fifth.
I was going to go for a number of races, like finishing races.
But that just shows a reduction in confidence in their ability to perform for next season. It doesn't mean it's not good. It just means their confidence isn't very high.
Yeah, and I think there's one thing here that we should also mention that we haven't talked about yet. Reliability. Because I believe that will be a factor at the start of these regulations.
That's why Cadillac's going to win. Cadillac's engine won't blow up, but just be very, very slow. Everyone else will fail. They'll win every race. There's my reckon.
So Ferrari with their own version of that power unit are going to fail.
Oh, I keep forgetting Cadillac. No, Audi. Sorry, I meant Audi.
You see, you're making that small error of believing that Cadillac are actually coming in as a full works deal to start with, and they've managed to escape that loop somehow, because I believe that was initially the reason why that they were, coming in as an 11th team, but that's been pushed back.
Wasn't this their engine idea? Wasn't this engine Regs put together to appease Audi?
This is, I don't think we have time on this show to go through the litany of complaints Summers has about the contortions the FIA has gone through for over 2 decades to try and get someone from Volkswagen into this sport.
Yeah, I mean, don't forget we were also supposed to get Porsche as well, and that never happened.
It's part of the same group, though, isn't it?
For whatever reason, they have been desperate to get someone from Volkswagen Group into Formula One as an engine manufacturer. And they just basically like, okay, well, here's your entrance test. Oh, did you fail that? Okay, we'll make it simpler. Here's your entrance test. Oh, did you fail that? Okay, we'll make it. So they made so many adjustments only to see Volkswagen bail. And then that had a negative impact on what the actual people participating in that regulation set really wanted to be competing on engineering wise. I guess they finally got got what they wanted, but also they got what they wanted. So we'll see how that turns out. I wanted to have a big discussion about energy flow and regen because my personal take is that mapping and energy recovery seems like there are going to be some very interesting places teams might be doing that. And that's going to wind up how much and how rapidly and how well you can keep your battery topped up enough to take advantage of your extra energy when you have it to overtake is going to be a very big deal, I think, especially at the beginning of it. But I think we might have to put a pin in that for a later time. So instead, I will finish with, I think, my favorite reckon of all. And we're just going to talk about the regs one final time, which is from Sean Mountcastle, who says, I reckon there is too much complaining. The F1 teams need to come up with solutions because it's an engineering competition. What do we think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I've long been... I've always thought that the regulations are the regulations. Politicking shouldn't be anything to do with the regulations. And unfortunately, it has become a factor in as much as that, and we've already seen it with these regulations in as much as that the teams have already been given more rope in order to hang themselves to be able to get better performance from the chassis and aerodynamic side of things. If we end up in a situation during this season where there are some choice things to be said about how to make changes, how much influence will the teams have and how much should they have? And that is always my problem with the sport in general, is that the teams are given too much rope and they shouldn't be regulating a sport that they are also active in being a part of. Only the FIA should be able to regulate the sport and make those kind of decisions, irrespective of, what the sport itself thinks about it.
I couldn't agree more. Personally, I would love to see, because you get so tired of teams starting a rumor in the press, then getting the FIA to investigate, and then they decide to nerf something, and then it's not the team that anyone wanted nerfed. It's some other team that just turned out to be a load-bearing column for them. I think teams should just get you can call for TV review. And if it's not a penalty, then you can't do it again. I think teams should get a chance to call one thing in straight up. And if it doesn't work out, then that's it for this season. You got to wait till next season before you complain about something. Geensy, you have a thought about this. What is it?
Yeah, I've always said now, especially now that we have a cost cap, it's like, I don't understand why they can't open the rules up much, because the whole thing about keeping the rules tight in the past was people would overspend and go crazy and other teams can't keep up. But now we have a cost cap. It's like, surely they can open the rules up much, much more, even on the whole aero platform of the entire car, and go crazy, do what you want, but you just can't spend more than what the budget is. And maybe it's got to be stricter on what they can and can't do with the budgets. But it's like, I think now that that's in place, there's so much more room for innovation, as it is an engineering sport. Go and engineer something with the money you've got. And, you got to have 4 wheels. It's got to have front and rear wings, and it can't have a fan on the back of it. Go mad.
Yeah, put the fan underneath then. Go ahead, Summers.
Well, yeah, but this is the problem, isn't it? So every time that you see what, quote unquote, is an innovation in Formula One, it gets destroyed within moments. Let's look at the last thing that we were really excited about was probably DAS. You know, something that we've never seen before, and we saw it for a season because all of the rest of the teams made such a huge statement to the FIA about how much performance it was possibly going to gain Mercedes, and can we have all these other systems in place, and so on and so forth. And the FIA have done a much better job in some respects, in my opinion, in dealing with this situation, in as much as that there's now timeframes involved. In the past, we had situations where as soon as something was considered to be outside the scope of what was considered to be the regulations, it was immediately gone. It was banned. And that can have a knock-on effect in terms of completely destroying the performance of a team. Whereas now we do have some leniency in that respect. A bit like, let's say, the rear wing situation we had at McLaren, which they decided to outlaw themselves. They were given a period to rectify the situation. So we all want to see innovation. As Alex has mentioned, it's an engineering sport. However, I do feel like there's some better balance that can be struck in terms of how we deal with that, because right now there's still problems in how you actually regulate the innovation of the sport.
So I'll bring it back to the a duo, the ability to test in season and to start setting parameters. Like right now, the architecture, all of this is very specifically set. I think if the FIA gains confidence in their abilities to measure and broadly keep performance within a specific window, then perhaps with a cost cap, we could once again see inline fours, V6s, maybe even 3s or 5s, and teams given a little more latitude to pursue what they really firmly believe to be the most efficient solution. But by that same token, the more room you give them to pursue that, the more it's going to cost if they're wrong and you do have convergence on a single thing. So I can understand it's a bit of a tightrope from a regulatory point of view. I want to keep on talking, but I feel like we're going to get yelled at if we keep on talking too much more. So, Geensy, have we managed to fully confuse you about these upcoming regulations? We've been at it more than an hour now. Do you understand less than when you started?
No, it's been good. It's been. I've listened to a lot of these shows, and I've sat there going, and it's been quite good to be able to go. Actually, hang on, stop. What does that particularly mean? And listen, there's a lot of this stuff. I believe there's a whole thing with a bunch of people who listen to this show or want to listen to this show more and understand it more. And because you two are on a similar playing field, it bringing me in is a bit like, oh, okay, hang on. I think the general public might have questions. So it's not entirely me, but some of it is me.
Well, thank you very much for being patient and
Thank you for having me.
asking us the questions our listeners really need to know the answer to. Where can people find you on social media? What are you up to?
Well, all my karting stuff is quiet for the moment because it's winter and it's cold and no one goes karting in the moment. So,
Excuses.
but still go and watch all my videos from the last GX UK karting season, which is on my YouTube channel, Alex Van Gene, Racing on YouTube, or Instagram, Alex Van Gene. I don't really do X anymore. I am on it, but I don't really do it. However, in a couple of weekends' time, on the 18th and 19th, I am doing pit lane reporting for the BRKC, which will all be fully live streamed on YouTube on BRKC's YouTube. So if you want to watch me trying to commentate on people making bad pit stops, come and watch that. It's a 2-day event and it's brilliant.
That sounds like loads of fun, and we will be sure and put links up to that once they appear. Summers, I feel like Geensy has insulted you by saying we're on the same plane. Clearly, you are the expert here, and I am just the pretensioneer. Nonetheless,
As in same plane that you understand what he's saying. Doesn't mean you know it. He knows it. You just understand it when he tells you it.
fair enough. Where can we find you? Where can we find your writing? And what are you working on that we should be looking out for?
So, as always, probably the best place, unlike Geensy, is to go to X, or Twitter as I still like to call it, Summers F1. And obviously, over the course of the next few weeks, I'll have some 2026 content coming your way as well. for Planet F1. So obviously keep an eye out for that. And a bit like Geensy, without the Formula One stuff at the moment, most of my attention other than Formula One has been turned to golf. So you can find that stuff on my YouTube channel as well.
And yes, we will be playing another match next time I'm back over the pond. Thank you very much. As for me, of course, I'm at MattPT55 on your social media of choice. Reach out, ask me questions, come say hi if you're in New York. And remember, until next time, this has been Missed Apex Tech Time.